Hello. What I wanted to do was just cover a short topic of what analysis do we need to modify as we start looking at some of the inputs into NDS, the CNCPS 6.55 samples. And so what I'd like to do, I ran across this situation on two dairies within the same state, probably within 30 miles apart from each other, and was looking at some samples of corn silage. And so what I'd like to do is show you these samples of corn silage. So as I was looking through the corn silage, getting the analysis back, I noticed that corn silage A had a crude protein of 6.7, an NDF of 40.9, starch about 28, and the 7-hour starch was 88.6 as reported from the lab. Farm B was feeding corn silage B, which was 7.5 crude protein, little less NDF, and as it had to be, the starch was pretty close to the same starch. The 7-hour starch value reported from the laboratory was almost the same, was exactly 1/10 of a percent off. And so as I started looking at these samples, comparing them, I actually did the 32-ounce cup test and took 32 ounces of the silage, poured it out on a table and started sorting through any kernel that was supposedly a whole kernel from the processing. And I did find a few halves, but this silage was chopped at a little less than 3/4 theoretical cut and was well processed. Both of these were within about 2 or 3% of the dry matter. I think this was a 34 and this was a 33 the day that I was looking at them from the Koster test on farm. Very similar to dry matter also from the lab analysis. This sample was a little longer cut, but you can see the number of kernels. I think as I was counting those up, there was between 12 and 13 whole kernels in that processing. So when we look at the analysis and when we're importing the XMLs from these samples, it is bringing in these 7-hour starch values. So you would think these two silages would actually be almost the same analysis in the NDS program using the 6.55. So let's go to NDS and just take a quick look. So what I've done is I've brought in a corn silage, not necessarily one of these corn silages, but what I did is I brought in a corn silages from a laboratory analysis, and you can see this silage is 35 dry matter, has a 40.7 ANDFOM, starch values about 31, and if we can go down, dial down through, we can go over to the constant calculations area, and as I did that, you can see the small little hammer that goes quickly by the screen. That's the VinSim calculator. And as you look at your yellow boxes here in the carbohydrate tab under constant calculations, you can see that we have a rate for our NDF of 4.5, and then we also have this value here filled, which is the measured UNDF 240. So using the old system, the calculated UNDF times 2.4, lignin times 2.4 was going to give you a value of 8.6 UNDF calculated in that sample. But what's interesting is now looking at it, the measured is about 3 units higher than than the old system was looking at. You can actually dial down into this NDF digestibility going here to the NDF digestibility tab, and you will see your 3 time points inputted, your rate calculated, and it will calculate the lag itself. So as you can look through, you can visually see what happens to your corn sample, the NDF in that fraction, the NDF residue that's remaining. So here are your fast pools. Here's your UNDF pool. Here was what we would theoretically think of as a slow pool. So here's the fast pool, slow pool, no pool. You can actually go look and see this on the other graph by the NDF digested. So here's our 30-hour, and we're at 22, 23% of the NDF digested, going up here to the 120 and then the 240. And the remainder of that sample from our 29 to our 40 would be our UNDF right up in here. So that's just on the NDF fraction. So let me go back to the carbohydrate tab. But what really gets us in trouble, I think, on dairies is looking at the imported 7-hour starch. So here is the starch amount. We're looking at that 30.9, but over here is the imported 7-hour starch number. And so I think that has got us into a little trouble. The test is exactly what we're asking the lab to do. We asked them to give us an analytical 7-hour starch digestion, but it may not be the best value for a corn silage, because what they do in the lab is they'll dry the sample down, grind it, and then do the chemical analysis to give us the 7-hour starch availability. But what is key to this is the dry matter of the sample, the NDF of the sample, and the starch percent of that sample. So if we go back and look at our 2 corn silage samples, what we need to get comfortable with is the processing here will determine that starch availability, especially on a high producing dairy cow when passage rate is high. So when passage rate is high, then digestion will be decreased. The old passage rate and digestibility equation that Bill Chalupa and Charlie Sniffen drove into us years ago. And as we get into groups of animals or herds that are eating 57, 58 pounds of dry matter intake, we have less passage, we have less digestion with increased passage rate. So again, what I've been doing is looking at those samples and the processing. So the 7-hour starch test has some validity, but also as the nutritionist on site, we have to be looking at those samples, determining the processing score, and helping adjust that 7-hour starch number. So as you can see, I have 2 different samples here, one with 2 different availabilities of starch. So if we go back to our sample and I look at a sample in NDS, when we ran across this situation several years ago, we went and looked at the data that we could accumulate from a dry matter of 35 dry matter of this sample with an NDF of 40 and with the starch of about 31. So looking at all the data that was available, there are some numbers that appear in red over here. And so these numbers are basically some guidelines that might help you look at the analysis of the starch availability in this corn silage. So I know that this corn silage, being a 35 dry matter, 40, and a 31 starch, is not going to be a 30% 7-hour starch for the KD. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to starch digestibility. You could adjust this number to any number that you would want, and these numbers will adjust. Or you can clean this screen, go back to the 7-hour, or go back to the carbohydrate tab, constant calculation, and you can override, hold down here, and these numbers will be directed over here. Now as I get used to this adjustment and I start watching it on dairies and stuff now, I can say that if this was a well-processed silage that, you know, I had several kernels in my physical exam of the silage using the 32-ounce cup method, I may run this up to a 26 or a 25. Now that will become the new number. What was in was the yellow box tied back to the starch digestibility from the lab XML import. And so what I can do is I can come to this, adjust it, and then if I do a save now, this will be, for this dairy, I may even take that back a tad bit. I was there, I ran a cup test on it. Now when I save this sample, then that will become the sample, saved sample analysis for there. Just going back to this, how does that make a difference on the dairy? And what I've not shown you so far was the other comparison that I just got this information back. So I could bring these diets up and show you these in NDS, but that would get into more nutrition than we want to cover in a short seminar or session here. But corn silage B and corn silage A, the farms again are 30 miles apart, same region. The energy corrected milk on those dairies that day, this dairy is a well-doing dairy. We were hitting 94.5 on energy corrected milk. This dairy here probably has a tad bit better management, more intensity into the herd. We spend more money on this recipe at that farm, and we're at 90.1 pounds of energy corrected milk. So just showing that the lab analysis that we get back from the laboratories are 100% correct. They do what we've asked them to do. I just don't think that we, looking at this, the 6.55 analysis, that is a very powerful number for corn silage, and gets back to the fact that we need people looking at corn silages, looking at feeds, characterizing the feeds, and then maybe even adjusting those corn silage 7-hour starches due to what you see on the farm, not just from the lab analysis. So again, job security for us nutritionists, and I just wanted to share that information with you and just do a little comparison. Thanks for your time.